but is merely yet another statement of what we would like and hope for, but is largely unachievable in view of our own self-imposed red lines. So all the arguments about a hard or soft Brexit, Norway or Canada, remain unresolved, and the arguments currently raging will continue, whatever the outcome, and will do so unless there is some real leadership from all parties as to where we really want to be. If the so-called deal is accepted, we have until the end of the transition period to try and resolve that. But if we follow precedent in the form of the last 2.5 years, what faith can anyone have in a resolution being achieved? Secondly, if it's agreed, we have until the 29th of March to enact the withdrawal bill and all the bills on a multitude of policies and issues which are promised, which provokes two questions. How is it going to be possible for Parliament to do a proper job of examining and scrutinising the legislation, to say nothing of scrutinising and debating the pile of affirmative statutory instruments now building up in this timetable? Even if we manage to deal with the legislation, can we be assured by government that we are not again going to limit our scope for negotiation in the transition period, and that we will not imprison ourselves within another set of red lines? And will not the ultra-Brexiteers threaten the government over that legislation, as they've done to date, to try and ensure that it becomes more difficult, if not impossible, to negotiate the close relationship with the European Union we're told by the government they desire? If the deal is rejected, this will not reduce the amount of legislative work to be done by the 29th of March, and it becomes increasingly clear that whatever the outcome of the vote in the other place, we have, through our own incompetence, presented ourselves with an almost impossible task. We need political leadership to level with people, now that it is blindingly obvious that we cannot leave the European Union and remain in anything like as an advantageous position as we enjoy as members, and certainly not if we insist on our red lines and reject customs union and single market and any involvement of the Court of Justice. Whilst I am realistic enough to realise that it is unlikely that I will see a withdrawal of Article 50. I do, however, believe that it is vital that we seek an extension of Article 50 so that the alternatives, unfettered by prior red lines, may be explored. Your Lordship's House is only required to consider the proposal, but we can hope our concerns are noted in the other place. The motion in the name of the noble Baroness Smith of Basildon is the only means of formally registering our concerns. And if it's moved, I'll vote for it. I'm grateful to her for emphasising the concerns many share about a no-deal scenario. Her motion also criticises the agreement of the declaration, but then that has been challenged across the spectrum of Remain and Brexit views. We should not have issued Article 50 before we knew what we hoped to achieve, or indeed without considering what would be possible. We did not, and we are about to pay the price of our own incompetence unless we can achieve more time for whatever we decide to do. My Lords, Parliament has a role to play, and if the proposals are indeed rejected, Parliament must fill the vacuum of political leadership and not abdicate responsibility to another referendum. But it must seek a compromise realistically acceptable to our own different parties and factions and to the European Union, without the fetters of ill-advised red lines. My Lords, we've had the farce. We must now avoid it turning into tragedy, and that needs to be an important consideration for this House and the other place.
My Lords, it is a pleasure to follow the Noble Lord Bonas, particularly as I agree with everything that he said. I suppose it is a truism that when two people in an organisation agree one of them is unnecessary, well, I don't think that applies to a legislative chamber. My Lords, I didn't speak in the last debate, and all I can say is that looking at what's been happening not just then but earlier, is that Brexit has sucked the life out of British politics. We just aren't functioning as a country anymore because Brexit dominates everything. There's no thinking going on, problems are not being dealt with, the ones that my noble friend talked about, poverty, the economy and so on. And we've got to move forward. My Lords, when this whole process began with the referendum, it was fairly clear that Northern Ireland was going to be one of the sources of enormous difficulty. Indeed, I argued at the time that even if one supported leave in every respect but one, Northern Ireland was a good reason for voting for Remain. I didn't support leave at all, but Northern Ireland itself was an argument for voting for Remain because there is simply no solution to it. I don't see any way forward, and nobody has yet been able to suggest one. And that, to me, is a good argument for thinking again about the whole thing. There is a way out, of course. That's to have a customs union, for us to be in it. And then the Northern Ireland border would not be a problem, and everything would be fairly straightforward. Now, for some reason, the government doesn't like the idea of our being in a customs union. There is the argument we must be free to negotiate with other countries. Well, all I would say is, let's look at how well Germany, within the EU, does trade deals with China and with other countries. Many of the European countries are knocking spots off us, and they're not at all constrained by being in the EU. And so I would have thought that our being in the customs union would not be a constraint on anything. It would be a positive move and be very, very helpful as regards Northern Ireland. My Lords, moving on to Dover, which I visited along with the Select Committee some time ago, one of the figures that was given to us was that it takes under 2 minutes to clear a container from within the EU. It takes on average of 1 hour and a quarter to clear a container from outside the EU. And there is simply no space at Dover to even make the arrangements for looking at the loads and so on to see whether they pass health tests. And frankly, unless we have a seamless operation in Dover, Kent will be a car park. And the whole of the process of stacking up along the M20, which we've seen when there have been some problems in Calais with farmers over the years, that whole problem will be much exacerbated. And I don't know what we're going to do. And none of the people who support leave have an answer to it. My Lords, I spent a lot of time knocking on doors during the referendum campaign. I was mainly in Hammersmith, and Hammersmith was 70-30 for Remain. So I wasn't getting a typical picture. Nevertheless, immigration was pretty well the only issue that came up. Whether take back control was interpreted by people as meaning immigration, I suspect it was. But at any rate, immigration was the thing that came up. And I was talking to a person, if I can recount one little doorstep encounter, talking to a woman who said she wasn't going to vote for Remain because of immigration. And I said to her, but look at the health service. I said I had a small procedure in Charing Cross Hospital. I was there for 1 day, and everybody who treated me, doctor, nurses and so on, they were all immigrants. Where would we be without them? And then she said something in reply, which was, I thought, quite significant. She said, it's not the ones that are here that bother me, it's the ones that are going to come in the future, which is where Boris Johnson and his 70 million Turks poised to enter Britain has a lot to answer for. That was Project Fear, if there ever was anything. And I think, my Lords, I believe that the referendum showed that there was a strong alienation in this country between people in the north and between people in the south. There was an alienation between people in the towns and the countryside and between the cities, and it's an alienation for which all political parties are responsible and which we've done very little to tackle. And I think the referendum result was a simple people saying, you don't care about me, so this is my answer to you. I'm just going to vote against the system. And I think that it was an argument for people who felt that the voices were not being heard. Finally, my Lords, I believe in a second referendum, but I've argued with myself for quite some time as to whether it is democratic or not to have another one. People argue on the other side that it is a total breach of faith with the electorate if we ignore the result of the referendum. I honestly don't believe that is so. I believe people are entitled to have their say yet again on the details when they know what it means. It's a bit like if you buy a house and you like it, you put in an offer subject to survey, and you get the result of the survey, and the survey says, the house is rubbish, all sorts of problems, and you withdraw. And I think it's quite legitimate for us to say it is democratic to say to the people of this country, we're going to give you another chance to have your say now that you know the details. And I don't understand why the people on the Leave side of the argument are so frightened of that. If they believe public opinion is still with them, then they should have the confidence for that. And I finish off by saying this, my lords. John Hume, great Irish Northern Ireland politician, member of the European Parliament, he knew a thing or two about peace processes. And he said the European Union, to his mind, was the most successful peace process in world history.
Well done, Al. My lords, I was unable to speak last time as I came after the plug was pulled. Then I was 128th, this time 59th. So some consolation, I suppose. But coming after so many in both debates who have eruditely expressed what I feel, I will be very specific. My concern is with the effect of the Prime Minister's deal, even worse the effect of no deal, on our prosperous, life-enhancing, soft power-boosting creative industries, now contributing over £1 billion to the UK economy. Why concerned? Because they have massively benefited from our membership of the EU. My lords, we live in a golden age of British creativity, a golden age Brexit, in my view, threatens to destroy. Before the recess, the noble Lord Bragg, surely a creative industry in himself, had a debate on the impact of Brexit on the arts. And read his speech and shake in your shoes, or I think he might say boots, but anyway, read it. Crucially, the creative industries rely on the ability of people to move freely across Europe, to work and travel without the need for visas. They rely on the free movement of instruments, of equipment, of samples without onerous and expensive tariffs, carnets and border checks. They rely on the automatic recognition of qualifications, allowing professionals such as architects to continue to practice in the EU. They rely on a digital single market that protects our IP, fought for by the UK from within the EU. They rely on investment from EU funds. They rely on country of origin, whereby the mutual recognition of broadcasting licences between the UK and the EU has led to this country being the leading hub in Europe for the international broadcasting sector. Some have already made arrangements to move their headquarters from the UK. These freedoms, these mutual agreements have both facilitated and fuelled the exchange of culture, creativity, expertise, and generated commercial and artistic opportunities. My lords, a particular concern is the government's position on immigration. There are, even before Brexit, 17 creative roles which are on the government's shortage occupation list. But the government has pledged to end freedom of movement from the EU and to reduce levels of what they refer to as unskilled migration, limiting migrants to those who earn over £30,000. As my noble friend Lord Newby pointed out in last year's debate, a move that would have severe negative effects on the agricultural, hospitality and care sectors, and, my lords, I add, the creative industries. Since that first debate, the government has published an immigration white paper and has asked the Migration Advisory Committee to, I will quote, review the shortage occupation list and the definition of skilled worker. Also, to engage businesses and employers as to what salary threshold should be set. But the white paper still clearly states that what the MAC recommends is retaining, and it's in black and white, retaining the minimum salary threshold at £30,000. So there seems to have been a movement on the word unskilled, but not on the threshold. Does the noble Lord the Minister not accept that that is simply semantics? And I am mystified as to where this unskilled equals earning under £30,000 came from. Can the noble Lord the Minister enlighten me? It certainly did not come from anyone who understands or works in the creative sector. Authors in the UK earn an average of just £10,500 per year. Musicians' earnings are on an average around £20,000. Artists, actors, illustrators, similar stories. As Baroness Bull said in her speech last year, salary levels are not a proxy for skills. And of course, this arbitrary equation disproportionately disadvantages those at the beginning of their careers, more often than not, the young. Then there is the fact that creative skills do not easily sit alongside the traditional qualifications and classifications that the Home Office use to evaluate visa applications. And many creative jobs are for SMEs, many for freelancers, without the resources to employ legal advice, or, for that matter, pay the compulsory immigration skills charge, which kicks in once we leave Europe. A number of authors from outside the EEA were refused entry to last year's Edinburgh International Book Festival because of complications in the visa application process. Is this a precursor of things to come? Are we to see European artists being deterred from performing in the UK? And, my lords, as the noble Earl Lord Clancarty has said, it is a two-way street, because there is a significant and important movement of the creative sector from the UK to the rest of the EU. But so important is the mantra, take back control, into which, let's face it, is inextricably wrapped no more freedom of movement, that the government does not listen. Last October, a group of musicians wrote an open letter laying out the problem. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg, MP, response was, Handel did not need the free movement of people to come to England to write the Messiah. As signatory of said letter, the composer Howard Goodall did some homework, and Handel did. A bespoke Act of Parliament had to be passed in 1727 precisely because free movement was not available to him. I rather fear, my lords, there would not be enough parliamentary time these days. Perhaps the noble Lord the Minister has a view. But seriously, neither Howard Goodall nor I are actually arguing that writers won't write, artists won't paint, musicians won't compose because of Brexit. It is the performing, touring, promoting, the essential cross-fertilisation of collaboration that is threatened. Liberal Democrats have consistently made the case for remaining in the EU because we know there is no deal better than the deal we have as members of the EU. Certainly not the chaotic, incoherent place we are now. The British people must be involved when a final deal emerges. We are a democracy, for goodness sake. As the noble Lord Pendry said, we have elections which allow us to change our minds. That is democracy. And to return to the noble Lord Bragg, he said in his debate on the arts, a referendum is not a sacred document, and I could not agree with him more. My lords, we need a people's vote. It is the people, not the politicians, that deserve the final say, as the noble Lord Dubs has said, and I believe that is what the people want.
Hear, hear. Hear.
The Prime Minister is inviting the House of Commons to approve the withdrawal agreement that she has made with the European Union. I am a Remainer, but like my noble and learned friend, Lord Hope of Craighead, I have reconciled myself to accepting that if the House of Commons were to approve that agreement, we should leave the European Union in accordance with the mandate in the referendum of June 2016. But it seems possible, probable, even probable, that there will be no majority for it. Indeed, with the House of Commons as it now is constituted, the only thing on which there probably is a majority is a determination not to leave the EU on 29th March with no deal. But that is the prospect that faces us imminently if the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement is not approved. My Lords, it's widely accepted that there would be serious economic consequences from crashing out from the EU without a deal. Certainly in the short term, probably in the longer term. Some Brexiteers are trying to reassure us by saying, don't worry, it may never happen. That does not seem to be a very good basis for sailing confidently into what the Prime Minister has described as uncharted waters. There is too much reason to think that at least some of it will happen, is indeed already beginning to happen. My Lords, the clock is at 5 minutes to midnight. There is only a bare 11 weeks to 29th March. There is not enough time before then to negotiate a different deal, even if the EU were prepared to do so. There is not enough time to organise and carry out a second referendum, even if it was thought necessary or desirable to hold one. The immediate priority must be to move back from the cliff edge, postpone the deadline and give ourselves more breathing space. So far as I can see, there are two ways of doing this. We could seek to defer the deadline and set a new date, or we could revoke our notice of withdrawal from the EU, which the European Court of Justice has explicitly confirmed that we can do unilaterally. The trouble about simply deferring the deadline is that that would do little to diminish the extent to which Brexit is dominating and distorting public and parliamentary business and industrial and commercial activities, or to mitigate the uncertainty and the rancour and the deep divisions which are bedeviling the situation at present. Before long, a new deadline would present us with a new cliff edge. Given the present state of the House of Commons, it will be prudent to assume that it will be difficult, if not possible, if not impossible, to conclude a deal with the EU which would meet with parliamentary approval in this Parliament. So I believe that if the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement is rejected by the other place next week, she should, without further delay, revoke the notice of withdrawal from the European Union on 29th March and undertake that there will be no further decision to give notice of withdrawal during the life of the present Parliament. That would avoid the perils and tribulations of leaving the EU with no deal. It would give more time to consider in detail and discuss with the EU what we should like to achieve as a permanent relationship with the EU of which we are not a member. It would give more time to legislate and organise a referendum, if that was thought to be desirable. As to that, I am not arguing for a second referendum, but the constituency has changed since June 2016, with some older voters dropping out and some newer voters coming in. We hear a lot about the 17 million who voted to leave, but less about the 16 million who voted to remain. The majority in the 2016 referendum was relatively narrow, and I do not think that it would be undemocratic to give the people an opportunity to confirm their views or change their minds in the light of all that has happened and become known since June 2016. And revoking the notice of withdrawal would enable the Government and Parliament to find time to address the many other important issues on which progress has been delayed or frustrated by the administrative and legislative complexities of Brexit. For the time being, my Lords, the Prime Minister has nothing to fear from threats of a no-confidence vote from the vultures on the backbenches of her party in the House of Commons. She has said that she will not lead her party into the next election. So she is in a strong position to exercise the responsibilities of her position as our Prime Minister in the national interest. My Lords, I suggest that if the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement is rejected in the other place, it will be very much in the national interest that we should not leave the EU on 29th March with no deal, and that we should be able to consider our long-term relationship with the EU without the deadline which is hanging over us like a sword of Damocles at present. My Lords, these suggestions are offered in pursuit of the doctrine which I associate with the noble Lord Healy, the late Lord Healy. When you have dug yourself into a hole, the first thing is to stop digging up.
My Lords, I acknowledge the experience of Lord Armstrong, and but I have to say that I disagree almost entirely with every word he uttered. My Lord, so it's come to this. After 2.5 years of trench warfare by Remainers, it's Parliament against the people, or at least most of Parliament against the majority of the people. As the broadcast media continues to pour out its anti-Brexit propaganda, who can be surprised that tempers are becoming frayed, and who is going to feel responsible as events unfold? My Lords, all great issues, I believe, are essentially very simple. We make them complicated when we don't want to face them. The plain fact is, we leave the European Union on the 29th of March. Remain fanatics, both inside and outside Parliament, have fought tooth and nail to obstruct the decision taken in 2016. Pretending they were trying to improve the situation, all their suggestions have been nothing more than distractions, sideshows, ruses, all designed for one purpose: to stop us leaving. Starting with the judicial review, we've had a meaningful vote, withdrawal agreements, second referendums, people's votes, backstops, postponing or revoking Article 50, and last but not least, a general election. My Lords, as far as I can see, there's as little point in pursuing any of these ideas further. Little point in further discussions. The arguments are increasingly circular and are leading us absolutely nowhere. Divisions are deep and abiding. The trouble is that when discussion stops, friction becomes more likely. And who is going to be held to blame for that? My Lords, the only sensible, positive and optimistic way forward is for us to accept that we are leaving the EU on the 29th of March and to make all the necessary arrangements as quickly as possible. Can we please slay the last big bogeyman that leaving without a deal will be disastrous? No more hysterical talk, and sadly we've heard it again now, of crashing out, BBC I think is the worst offender, cliff edges, catastrophes. There's never any really detail of how and why these things could or should arise. And my Lords, can I make a plea? Can I urge Remainers not to continue their virulent disparagement of our leaving without a deal? It helps no one. The noble Lord Lilly, who knows much about these things, has set out detailed reasons why leaving without a formal deal is workable and indeed has many advantages. And he understands the position, I believe, better than anyone. Time does not permit me to list them all here, but just some of them to mention. The UK will not pay its 39 billion divorce bill. It avoids a transition period, and we can get on with things straight away. There's no need for an Irish backstop. The UK as a whole will be able to enter a Canada plus type deal. WTO is a safe haven, not a hard option. And UK exports to countries trading on WTO term rules have grown 3 times faster than to the EU. I could go on. The noble Lord deals with most of the issues that we are concerned with, in my opinion, very adequately. My Lords, by statute, we leave the EU on the 29th of March. Only by statute can this be stopped, and that would be a truly disastrous course of action. The only way possible to bring together the different factions in this issue and at the same time move the nation forward to a better and more positive future is to put our differences behind us if we can and set ourselves a common goal. And I suggest the noble Lord Lilly's proposals show us the way.
Lord Framlingham opened up by expressing his total disagreement with what the previous speaker, the Noble Lord Armstrong, said. So I'm going to repay the compliment by saying I didn't agree with one word of what you said, if I may say that. We're in the position today where we're waiting to see if the government can produce that little bit of magic, parliamentary magic, in the next few days that will save the Prime Minister's deal with the EU. The Prime Minister is rummaging around for a winning formula, including, I read today, contemplating possible guarantees that workers' rights will be aligned with the EU indefinitely. Now, I have to say, my lords, that the TUC are very sceptical about the government's sincerity, given its record of hostility stretching back so many years on this particular subject. But I am glad that at long last, and it's been a long time, that the government are beginning to reach out beyond the Conservative Party, although it seems far too late to garner additional support for any deal that will be put in the other place next Tuesday. There should have been this process at the start of the proceedings after the referendum result. The government should have led a process which got people together to see what would be the most practical way of dealing with that result and with the European Union in future. And instead, we're faced with it at the 11th hour as the government faced desperately a pretty bleak prospect next Tuesday. Trapped by her own red lines and a fractious party, the Prime Minister is, I believe, likely to be forced just next week by the need to come up with a plan B. And it's that prospect I want to address briefly this morning, or this afternoon. Plan B surely cannot be no deal, which would be a recipe for chaos across a wide range of this nation's activities, including a hard Irish border, and my noble lords, Lord Lilly and Framlingham, might ignore that particular inconvenient truth, but a hard Irish border is not something anybody with a knowledge of the history of Ireland would fancy. It's a desperate situation. There would be huge pressures at the ports, as we've already heard from previous speakers, and no doubt we would find ourselves quickly approaching EU countries again to help us out of the mess in the event of having gone down the no-deal route. And this time it would be against a backdrop of chaos and disruption. Now, the Prime Minister famously said, no deal is better than a bad deal. Well, now she's come back with a bad deal, including a vacuous, aspirational political declaration about the future, which is no more than a wish list and a programme for intensive talks over the next 2 years, designed, ironically, to get us as close as possible to the current status quo as we can. This deal that's to be presented and voted on in the other place next week is a mechanism for more uncertainty, not less. It gives no security. It gives insecurity, lots of rows and more dislocation. And I certainly cannot support it and will be supporting the amendment in the name of my noble friend Baroness Smith. But let's be clear, my lords, no deal is the default option. It will happen on March the 29th unless there is an alternative plan. The need for such a plan is therefore now very, very urgent, and if the Cabinet can't come up with one, Parliament must rise to the occasion and do so. The PM has recently added a third possibility, no Brexit, admittedly more as a threat rather than as a real option. But it should be crystal clear to everyone that anything a UK government negotiates will be less favourable than our current membership, less favourable in almost every respect: economic, trade, security, financial services, science, education and culture. All will be worse than the status quo. And the reason given not to recognise this is that we must respect the result of the referendum of 2016. Now, I take that very seriously. I initially had that view, but the cost, the disruption, the risk to jobs and workers' rights and to the economy have become clear. They're all too tangible, and they can't be dismissed as airily as yet another Project Fear. So when the facts change, you should change your mind, as a famous economist famously advised, or as a wise miners' leader says, be a movement, not a monument. I therefore favour asking the British people to take a fresh look at the position through a people's vote with a firm Remain option on the ballot. We are, unfortunately, a long way from that situation. I cannot yet see a solid majority for that option in the other place, and both the main parties' front benches are not favourable, at least as yet. And if the Commons go for this option, obviously the Electoral Commission could have a tricky job in sorting out and securing support for the appropriate question. And one other option should therefore be kept in play, the compromise option of remaining in the EEA and rejoining EFTA. I hope noble lords have a chance to read two pamphlets, one by my noble friend Lord Lee and Michael James Clifton of the EFTA Court, and one by Lucy Powell MP and Robert Halfon MP. These set out clearly how this option could be made to work through retaining membership of the single market and the customs union while leaving the EU with no problems in relation to the Irish border. It could just be an acceptable compromise. It's everyone's perhaps second best, but it should not be ruled out too easily at this stage. So, my lords, in conclusion, we must encourage the other place who have huge decisions to take to be stateswomanlike and statesmanlike, to prompt them to rise to the occasion and to give a lead to the nation. The Cabinet have been failing to do this. Now at least it's Parliament's turn, and we, especially the other place, cannot afford to fail.
It is a pleasure to be able to follow Lord Monk's, because I too agree with the conclusion which he has reached. I support the motion in the name of Baroness Smith of Basildon. Many reasons, powerful reasons, have been given in the course of the debate in December and over the last day or so that support that view. There is one issue, however, I wish to raise, which is different, but I think is illustrative of the problems that this deal will cause. Because in my view, what we should be doing is focusing on the longer-term effects of the deal and what it does for our future negotiations. That issue relates to the position of the UK as the leading centre in the world for international commercial and business litigation. It is chosen by countries and businesses from all over the world. Now, I do appreciate that in speaking about work for lawyers, I am not adopting a cause that wins universal popularity. But it is important to recognise the very substantial contribution, measured in billions, that this work provides for the UK economy, and importantly to Her Majesty's Treasury. After the referendum, a good deal of work was done by the legal profession and the judiciary on what was needed to safeguard the preeminence of the United Kingdom by ending the uncertainty on which our competitors were starting to rely, and providing the certainty that those negotiating a jurisdiction clause require. A paper was presented to the Ministry of Justice and other arms of government in late 2016. In the summer of 2017, the government was asked urgently to take a number of steps, and particularly to work with the EU to ensure that there was a simple and flexible regime for the mutual recognition and enforcement of civil judgments on our departure from the EU when we have ceased to be party to the EU regime. In August 2017, the government published a paper for partnership for a cross-border civil judicial cooperation with the EU after we leave the EU. This was a pragmatic and realistic way forward, which I fully supported then and support now, as it would provide the certainty so badly needed and support the ongoing work that the judiciary and the legal profession is undertaking to try and preserve the preeminence of the UK in this area. The question for me is, what is the effect of the deal on the position of London and the rest of the United Kingdom. Plainly, the continuation of the status quo by the withdrawal agreement of itself presents no problem. But the all-important political declaration is a matter on which I wish to focus. It provides nothing in respect of the government's August 2017 proposals in respect of the enforcement of civil judgments. Now, I surmise that this is not because the government has changed its mind, but rather this was one of the matters that it was unable to include in the political declaration. Why? Not because of its lack of importance, but because it seems to me that the negotiating position of the UK has become so weak for the reasons given, even at a time when we still have leverage through the financial contribution that we are to make. But what is more important is the next stage of the negotiations. And in considering that, we ought to look at the position of the EU 27, as their attitude will be a vital factor. In this area, they are our competitors. They have not been idle. In Paris and in Amsterdam, commercial courts have very recently been established where the proceedings are conducted entirely in English. They are being actively promoted as a much better alternative to the UK, as their judgments will be recognised and enforceable across the EU, and because of the certainty of their position. Germany and Belgium are considering doing the same. Last Friday, the Taoiseach is reported as saying that the Irish Bar Council and the Law Society took the view that one of the areas that could benefit from Brexit are legal services, on the basis that Ireland could take some business from the UK. Once lost, this work, which contributes so much to our economy, will be difficult to get back. Let me then turn quickly to the next stage of the negotiations. It is inevitable from the deal that the UK's negotiating position will be very much weaker in many respects. The deal, in effect, enables our former partners in the EU to control the pace and the outcome of the negotiations to their advantage and to our disadvantage, particularly through the leverage that the backstop provides. I agree with the many who have pointed to the multitude of other flaws in the deal. Long and complex negotiations, for that is what they will now be, will advantage our competitors in the EU 27, as they will be able to continue to exploit the uncertainty so caused. For this, and for all the other reasons given during this debate, the deal looked on as a whole and its medium and long-term effects will have a very damaging effect. And, in my view, those that must make the decision in the other place would be well advised to reject it. I see the force of the point so eloquently made to the dilemma in the UK and what we all face, as made by many, including the learned and noble Lord Hope of Craighead. The issue for decision-makers is to weigh the manifest disadvantage of this deal against the alternative courses of action that have been explored in the debate. By my support of the motion, I would rule out a no deal. But in my view, the other alternatives, for the reasons given by others, which I need not repeat, are all options that will do much less serious medium and long-term harm to the UK economy than entering into this deal. I include within the other options another referendum, as it is clear that the effect of Brexit would be greatest on the young generation. They should be given the chance to express their views in the light of what is now known.
My Lords, it's my pleasure to follow the noble and learned Lord Thomas. He's given me yet another reason why I should support the motion in the name of the noble Baroness Lady Smith of Basildon. I wondered whether, having spoken in the original incarnation of this debate, I should take part in its successor. But, my Lords, December the 6th seems so very long ago. The ground is shifting, so I feel justified in taking another bite at Brexit. In December, I voiced my concerns over the withdrawal agreement and its concentration on trade in goods, while it's services that are so pivotal to the UK economy. Those concerns have been deepened by the latest news from the Office for National Statistics. Yesterday, it reported that in the third quarter of last year, production from the services sector was just 0.1% higher than a year earlier. That's the slowest growth in 2 years, and it's a very bad omen for our economy. Services account for 3/4 of our earning power, and if that's not going to grow at a decent rate, then the economy as a whole is not. We shouldn't be surprised by these gloomy numbers. It's the uncertainty over what Brexit really means for services, particularly financial services, that has forced them to take the wise precaution of preparing for the worst. Research just published by Ernst & Young shows that since 2016, financial services companies have announced plans to move around £800 billion worth of staff, operations and customer funds out of the UK to the other EU 27 countries. And gradually, these moves are happening. Day by day, jobs, money and investment are leaving the UK. My Lords, as we contemplate that massive hit being inflicted on our economy, it's worth reminding ourselves just what we will, in theory, save by leaving the EU. The ONS tells us that in 2016, our net contribution was £9.4 billion. Remember, I've just mentioned 800 billion leaving the UK. That 9.4 billion is just 1.2% of government expenditure. And that's before taking account of any of the money that flows from the EU back to the private sector in this country. EU membership in 2016 cost us just 39p per person per day. Very much less than the business being hemorrhaged out of the country now. And just think what that 39p bought us in benefits, not least the ongoing security and peace that we've enjoyed for so long. I've listened to those noble lords who've assured us that Britain will be great again and we must go forth with confidence. My noble friend, Lord True, while urging us to look to the future, declared yesterday that the world out there is as big and round now as it was in 1492. People are waiting to do business with us, he said. What are they waiting for? My lords, we've already heard from the noble Lord Dubbs that Germany and other EU countries are already, from within the EU, doing much more in export markets than the UK. It's not membership of the EU that's holding us back. It might be product, it might be services, it might be, as Lord Neil, the noble Lord Neil said yesterday, our abysmal productivity, but it's not membership of the EU. And if Lord True does know those countries and those people who are waiting to do business with us, could he just urge them not to wait any longer? We very much welcome them now. Neither do I believe that it's a lack of functioning ports that's holding us back. Nevertheless, I hope that the Brexit chaos might have produced just a small nugget of good news with the plans to reinvigorate Ramsgate as a freight port. My lords, a few years ago, the Royal Military Canal in Hythe was being dredged. Along its length, there were big placards declaring that this work was being in part funded by the EU, and they bore the wonderful slogan, "Dredging for a better future." I pledged that I would do my best to find an occasion when I could use this slogan. And when I heard what was going on in Ramsgate, it seemed to me that this at least might be an example of the government dredging for a better future. But, my lords, yesterday, the Mayor of Ostend put paid to that. He told the BBC it was completely impossible that Ostend would be ready to cope with freight ferries from Ramsgate any time soon, and certainly not by March the 29th this year. So whatever's going on in Ramsgate, I'm afraid it's not dredging for a better future. In fact, there is no better future ahead at the moment. It looks unutterably gloomy. Brexit is not Brexit. It's an embarrassing shambles, and whether it's this deal or no deal, it's not in the interests of this country. The only democratic way to determine what happens next is to give the people a vote, whether they want to proceed with this nonsense or stop it. My belief is that for 39p per person per day, they decide that staying in the EU is a very sensible thing to do, and they would vote to remain. After that, business could invest with confidence, people could move freely around Europe, and the embarrassing exercise that this national harakiri is amounting to could be abandoned.
My Lords, I very much agree with much of what Noble Baroness Whitcroft said. I do feel some constraint, and as we were advised on this by Lord Mackay Cashfern earlier, we are addressing a bill to leave the EU, and so I'll try and limit my remarks for the most part to how we could get a better outcome while still leaving the EU. And I do think there is one. It's been touched on by my noble friend, Lord Monks. But just in order to give some shape to what I want to say, first of all, there are issues of substance, such as the single market and the customs union, which address questions like Dover-Calais and the Irish border question. But there are then endless issues of process, ranging from the role of Parliament, a general election, or referendum, or perhaps tossing a coin. Now, these two are quite separate things which get mixed up. So, on what I call the substance, the Institute of Government said the other day that there is a spectrum of trade-offs, and we have to decide where there can be any sort of parliamentary majority between these trade-offs. I think that's exactly right where we are today. I think there can be such a majority, and I think it is in the area, as has been said, of moving from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 of the European Economic Area. By the way, my lords, I heard it said in the corridors, well, who's ever heard of the EEA? May I just say, I don't know whether people who say that sort of thing, how many of them fly to Alicante or some other part of the continent for their holidays and come back to Gatwick, which is hopefully open when they get there. And the answer is they come through a queue with a big heading saying EEA, or to be a bit more technical, EEA and Switzerland. So that is the queue that we go through. And if I can ask the noble Lord the Minister to perhaps check before Monday, as they've got time to get an answer to these questions, what will happen? The noble Lord Clannan perhaps would like me to repeat that. What will happen to the EEA queue at Alicante or at Gatwick?
Get longer.
Well, apart from getting longer, will it be there, and who will be able to go through it? Now, I would like to stay in the single market and the customs union, and the pamphlet which I did help prepare does indeed point out, Liberal Democrats please note, how it could be done successfully. And I think that it would be, in order to keep in the customs union long term and the single market, and my basic difference from the government's proposal is in fact exactly this. We would stay long term in the single market and long term in the customs union, or if you want to use the indefinite article, a customs union negotiated with the EU, which I think would be By the way, as I understand, the objections, and again I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, to doing this aren't objections from Brussels. These requirements or suggestions weren't requested. If I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected. But the objections were objections in London, ideological objections, because of certain parts of the Conservative Party. Now, somebody also made a remark in this context that we feel trapped. Baroness Butler-Sloss, I think, said, well, how do we get out of this trap? Well, they're not the only people who are trapped. They're trapped in Bolton, who see their public services disappearing, and their industries disappearing, and their services disappearing, all at the same time. And to that extent, I think that my Labour friend Lord Grocott made a very valid observation. People feel they're on the dumping ground of history. Well, without, as it were, mentioning Professor Trump, he's not a professor, is he? He can't even read a book, I don't think. But anyway, President Trump, we are aware of that sort of politics. To go further onto the point mentioned by my noble friend Lord Monks, we earlier in the year did put down this amendment to have a parliamentary role in a mandate. A mandate, like in a trade union, you have a mandate and then you have the executive look at the results of the negotiation by reference to the mandate. That was not done, and it was a pity. And it was the Commons that rejected it, not the Lords. But if there had been such a mandate, we would have been a little further forward, such as looking at the proto-treaty, which emerged on December 20th, when we were on our way home for Christmas, about the EFTA-EU separation agreement. And I would like to ask the Minister to reply on Monday how he would, if we did wish to synchronise the clocks of leaving the EU and rejoining EFTA, how that would actually work, and is it compatible with this proto-treaty published on the 20th of December. In conclusion, I think that the idea that the EEA is incapable of reform is not the case. It was always intended by Jacques Delors that it would evolve. It would be a different organisation with Britain back in it. There is no doubt about that. But the objection to it that when we have left the table, we wouldn't have a vote. Even Boris Johnson's logic, surely, wouldn't demand that we leave the table, we don't pay any money, and yet we complain about not having a vote. So I'll finish where I began. To get out of the mess that we're in at the moment, we are very much hoping that there will be support in both houses for the emergence, as I think there will be, of some sort of interest in an amendment next week that we stay within the European Economic Area.
I hope the Minister who will reply has noted the strong speech from Lord O'Neill of Gatley, echoed by Lord Dobbs just now, that the Conservative Party's internal confusion over Brexit distracts the government from Britain's underlying problems of inequality, poor productivity, poor housing and the north-south divide. Resentment over those neglected problems drove a large part of the vote to leave. Failure to address them will leave the country bitterly divided, whether we leave the EU or stay. But I want to challenge the deliberately misleading claims being made about the financial implications of the EU withdrawal agreement and about the impact of withdrawal from the EU in the long term. The Prime Minister, on Monday, announcing the new 10-year plan for the NHS, said that the extra financing would be available, I quote, because we will no longer be sending vast annual sums to Brussels, thus with no increase in people's taxes. David Davis, on the BBC Today programme on Tuesday, declared that leaving without a deal would free us from any future financial obligations, thus giving the government a full £15 billion a year to redistribute to other spending programmes. Yes, the EU has been a net contributor to the EU budget. We are the second largest contributor after Germany, as a wealthy country with a large population, although in terms of contributions per head, we are the fifth largest after the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany and Denmark. We should, of course, also remember that Norway contributes more per head to this explicitly redistributive budget as a rich non-member which benefits from access to the single market. We have developed common institutions and agencies which have saved us money from sharing resources and which will cost us more to set up again on our own. We have benefited from common programmes which, when we leave, we will have to fund ourselves. And we have contributed to Europe's global world in an uncertain world, global role in an uncertain world, a global Britain within a global Europe rather than against a global Europe. When we joined the European community in 1973, George Thompson, as a British Commissioner, set up the Regional Development Fund to assist poorer regions across the Member States, through which funds flowed back to peripheral regions, including within Scotland and the rest of the UK. Margaret Thatcher, whom the Lord Forsyth, I know, is a particular proponent of, declared in her Bruges speech in 1988 that Prague, Warsaw and Budapest were also part of Europe. Successive British governments championed Eastern enlargement from 1990 on, and funds thereupon began to flow, including from our contribution, to the poorer states of Eastern Europe and to others outside the EU in the European neighbourhood, more than to France, Italy or Spain. That has been a shared investment in our security, in European security, since the end of the Cold War. We've not yet negotiated the terms of our future relationship, but ministers have repeatedly stated that they want the UK to remain closely associated with many of the EU's existing programmes, from Horizon 2020 and its successor fund for research and innovation, to the Erasmus Student Exchange Programme, to Europol and the intelligence networks which contribute to our shared security, to the European Defence Agency, which supports cooperation in defence procurement. It would damage our economy to cut ourselves off from commonly funded trans-European networks in energy and in telecommunications. Ministers have promised that we will continue to pay our share of these programmes in return for continuing participation. The political declaration on our future relationship, paragraph 11, refers to, I quote, a fair and appropriate financial contribution in return for UK participation in these. The government hasn't yet told us how much it will cost to replace EU spending within the UK on programmes from which we will withdraw: agricultural and environmental support, financial transfers for our poorest regions, and funding for scientific research and universities if we don't remain within those EU programmes. Even the hardest Brexit supporters seem to think that these funds will somehow continue to flow. Sir John Redwood declared last week that Brexit would allow us to cut tariffs and grow more of our own food. And how we will manage to grow more of our own food without financial support for agriculture, I simply do not understand. No one in the referendum campaign explained that Britain benefited from the many common institutions and agencies we shared with other EU states. Now that we are leaving, we are already spending heavily on duplicating them. We need an upgraded national medicines agency, for instance. We need to recruit additional diplomats. We are already recruiting them to manage our bilateral relations with our European partners and others. We now have a new Department of International Trade. The Institute for Government, in a recent report, reports that DEFRA has increased its staff by 2/3 since the referendum to handle repatriated agricultural and environmental regulation. HMRC estimates that it needs 5,000 more staff and a complex new computer system. The border force is woefully short of staff and actively recruiting. We cannot take back control of our coasts and waters without a substantial increase in the Coast Guard and more maritime patrol vessels. On top of what has already been spent, the Chancellor announced in December a further £2 billion for Brexit preparations distributed across 25 government departments, bringing spending on Brexit so far close to £5 billion. No doubt there will be more to come. David Davis's dream of leaving Europe without any further commitments assumes that our continental partners will continue to cooperate with us, whatever we do and however we behave. Less reckless politicians understand that borders cannot be managed, nor trade maintained, without active cooperation with neighbours. So talk of some sort of managed no deal floats around. We have, after all, 1,000 border force staff in France, Belgium and the Netherlands at present to speed travellers and goods across the Channel. And I expect Lord Forsyth assumes they will stay there so that there will continue to be frictionless trade. If we want them to stay in post and still benefit from other shared networks, we cannot simply walk away from the legacy costs of EU membership that David Davis, Lord Forsyth, Baroness Noakes and Lord Framlingham also in this debate all want to deny. There is therefore no Brexit dividend. It's a sign of desperation that the Prime Minister is now claiming what Boris Johnson put on the side of the bus, which the Chancellor must have told her is nonsense. Brexit is already imposing substantial extra costs on the British government. It will impose longer-term costs, both on the budget and on the wider economy.
Good speech.
Very good.
My Lords, many of us hoped that the holiday season would clear our minds and lift the Brexit fog. But alas, the fuzziness remains and has come back with a vengeance. More worryingly, the ideological divides between and within families, communities and political parties show little sign of being resolved, let alone healed. Yet the eyes of the world are on us, particularly from the business community, whose primary focus is to secure a timely decision and path to certainty, especially at a moment when the headwinds of the global business cycle are turning against us. Our international reputation for political stability and mature, predictable and rational decision-making has already been dented. The actions of Parliament in the coming days and weeks will determine how the UK continues to be perceived by global investors with very real economic consequences. With less than 80 days to go before the expiry of Article 50, this is not a time for political hand-wringing. There is plenty of evidence from Hansard of advice ignored and warnings neglected. The time for protracted debate has ended. It is time to decide. Extending Article 50 is unlikely to produce a fundamentally different set of choices or trade-offs which we are not already aware of. At this stage in the life of a complex negotiation, it is not about tinkering with individual clauses, but evaluating the balance of advantage of the deal, taken as a whole, compared to other credible and deliverable alternatives. My Lords, to govern is to choose. That is why brinkmanship has its natural limits. Indeed, it feels like brinkmanship is the order of the day, whether between the US Congress and White House on the federal budget, or between Washington and Beijing on trade tariffs, or the Janus-like face-off on Brexit between the Prime Minister and Parliament and Brussels simultaneously. Taking things to the wire can play a legitimate part in a robust negotiation and help test boundaries. But in international diplomacy, there are limitations on playing poker with people's lives and livelihoods. We should also remember that an open hand holds more than a closed fist. As the Noble Lord Tugendhat reminded us in the previous debate, Brexit is a process, not an event. We are barely at the end of the beginning. So we will need to draw upon a store of goodwill with our European partners over many years, and it is the end destination that matters most. That is why leaving the EU without a negotiated withdrawal agreement has no credibility. The Justice Secretary rightly describes no deal as a unicorn. But sadly, there are still enough MPs willing to chase the unicorn who can block the Prime Minister's deal. They will continue to do so, however many times she brings a vote back to Parliament, and regardless of any further assurances received. It is therefore abundantly clear, and has been since last July, when the Chequers plan was unveiled, that a deal cannot secure approval without the support of opposition MPs. The only viable path for the Prime Minister following the outcome of next Tuesday's vote is to conduct a discovery process aimed at establishing whether there are enough opposition MPs willing to set aside their party whip and act in the national interest to support an alternative Brexit plan. To draw an analogy with financial markets, a clearing price is often discovered through a book-building process to gauge demand at different levels. It is this type of process of so-called indicative votes which is required to help determine the next steps. Opposition parties, once they have exhausted their inevitable attempt at holding a no-confidence vote in the government, should allow Parliament to have a series of free votes and enable MPs to reveal their true preferences. It is likely that such a process will confirm that the House of Commons opposes no deal, as the amendments to the Finance Bill have already signalled, and that MPs prefer a softer form of Brexit, perhaps tilted more towards Norway than Canada. Some will inevitably view this as a betrayal of Brexit, but it simply reflects the change in parliamentary arithmetic following the 2017 general election. It also reflects the consequences of a simple binary referendum. There are at least 17.4 million versions of Brexit, and there is no settled consensus on which path to pursue. The Prime Minister, to her credit, has tried to chart a middle course which strikes a balance between safeguarding prosperity and regaining sovereignty. The more difficult part to swallow is not the backstop, but the flimsy nature of the future framework and the absence of any interconditionality with payments being made to the EU. To use a financial markets analogy again, we have simply secured a 39 billion option value on negotiating a trade deal. Some would consider this an expensive option, but in the context of a £2 trillion economy, it is a bearable price to pay. What is less bearable is replacing one form of uncertainty with another. We have limited control on the future timetable and cannot impose any sanction or penalty on the EU if a deal is not finalised by the end of 2020. In fact, my noble friend Lord Macpherson has suggested that it will take us until the middle of the next decade to finalise a future deal. So we are forced to take much on trust and must be prepared for an extended period in Brexit limbo. It is ironic that the foremost of the Prime Minister's 12 negotiating objectives in her Lancaster House speech in January 2017 was delivering certainty and clarity. I have previously described the situation we find ourselves in as a grubby compromise, but it is a necessary compromise if we are to find a way through which reconciles so many conflicting objectives, pressures and realities. I sincerely hope that Parliament can solve this most difficult of Rubik's cubes, but we must be prepared for the very real possibility that there is a blocking minority for every option, resulting in deadlock. In these circumstances, we will rapidly become a zombie Parliament and lose all remaining authority. In such a situation, a fresh democratic process, whether a referendum or general election, will become inevitable.
My Lords, I had intended my contribution in your Lordship's debate before Christmas to be my first and last speech on this subject of Brexit. But as speaker number 93 in that debate, I don't think my words carried a great deal of weight. And those of you who thought otherwise will have read them in Hansard over Christmas. Either way, I don't intend to repeat what I said then, but to make a couple of comments on what seems to have happened in the meantime. First, it's my perception that few, if any, of those involved in this debate have changed their views. And if anything, most people, both in and outside politics, appear to be further entrenched in their opinions. There is no evidence it seems to me that the government have wrung any substantive concessions from the EU in relation to the backstop. And consequently, it seems that it's a widely held view that the DUP has not changed its opposition to the Prime Minister's deal, and consequently, therefore, I doubt the ERG has either. All in all, I think it is widely accepted that the government's withdrawal agreement will probably be rejected by the other place next week. A number of noble lords have, and it seems to me reluctantly some of them, concluded that one way forward is a second referendum or a people's vote. Other noble lords speaking have rejected this as impractical, unrealistic and likely to increase the unpleasant and divisive nature of the current debates. I agree with that view, but more importantly, I note that the head of steam that would seem to be gathering in favour of the people's vote before Christmas has substantially subsided since then, and I perceive there is no real desire, except within a very small group of Remainers, to pursue this option. Similarly, but for other reasons, it seems unlikely there will be a general election. If the withdrawal agreement is indeed rejected, the DUP will probably support the government in a vote of no confidence. Few, if any, Tories will vote against their own party, and clearly a significant number of Labour MPs, fearing either deselection or their leader's unsuitability for high office, do not want an election either. Despite the convolutions of motions and amendments in the other place designed to avoid a no-deal Brexit, or possibly any Brexit at all, it is a fact that both houses have, by significant majorities, put in place two pieces of legislation that ensure we will leave the EU on March the 29th. Only the government can initiate repeals or substantial amendments to those pieces of legislation, and as of today, that's not going to happen. We could, of course, as some noble lords have said, seek to delay Article 50. This requires the agreement of all 27 EU countries, and it seems that will only be forthcoming if the delay is for a specific reason. It also requires the government, not Parliament, to execute this, and as of Tuesday, the government confirmed this would not happen. It seems to me, therefore, that the assumption, if all this is correct, that all that is left to debate is the manner of our departure. One option, presumably, is to go back to the EU, as several noble lords have said, and accept Mr Tusk's offer, repeated by Mr Barnier, of a Canada Plus-style deal. It's not perfect. There are undoubted problems, mostly due to the short timetable, but there's no doubt we could make it work, and we could make it work well, too. It has previously been rejected on the basis it didn't solve the Irish border question. But as the United Kingdom government has made it clear we will not erect a hard border, the Irish government has confirmed that it will not erect a hard border, and now Mr Juncker has confirmed that the European Union will not erect a hard border. The problem of a hard border, which should never have been raised in the first place, has now largely evaporated. But the most likely scenario is that we will leave the EU without a deal on WTO terms. I recognise that many of your lordships find this prospect alarming and even frightening, and I respect those concerns. But I also note that most, if not all of them, have been addressed. If both the CEO of the Port of Dover and his counterpart in Calais say that they have in place the resources to manage those changes, then the onus is on those who disagree to explain exactly why, rather than simply shouting the odds repeatedly. The pharmaceutical industry, for example, consists of many well-managed businesses. The idea that they have made no preparations in the last 2 years and are simply waiting for their UK markets to implode is ludicrous. They will manage the changes and the risks in the same way that business always manages change and risk. I don't know if Brexit will be chaos or it will be another millennium bug. But when men like my noble friend Lord Bamford, who's sadly not in his place today, Sir James Dyson and Sir Rocco Forti, all who personally lead their own world-class international businesses on which their own family fortunes and reputations have been built and depend, publicly state that they are confident they will thrive on WTO terms, I take some comfort from their confidence. So let us, my lords, put aside talk of people's votes and general elections, which aren't going to happen, of delaying Article 50 or employing devious parliamentary devices to make the government's life more difficult, and focus on a successful departure from the EU on March the 29th. Now, your lordships can help this process or hinder it, But the British people will be justifiably angry with those who put political point scoring above our country's best interests, which is to complete Brexit as best we can.
Very good. My Lords, if there were no other reason for supporting the motion before us today, for me it would be Ireland. So much was achieved in the Good Friday Agreement, but that was only a beginning. And what has been important in building a secure and stable future for Ireland, Northern Ireland, has been the immense amount of dedicated work going at all levels on intercommunal relations in the practical sense. And what has facilitated that is the reality that while we were members of the European Union, minority in Northern Ireland felt that there was an equivalence because it had the Charter and the European Union's position on human rights as a context within which this is happening, and not just a British traditional approach to justice. The question has been raised in this debate is what's changed since December. For me personally, a great deal has changed. I spent a lot of time over the recess talking to a wide cross-section of people, and I was dismayed at the way and degree to which there was disenchantment amongst thinking, intelligent people about political institutions in Britain and how we were mishandling the situation. My Lords, the situation, in my view, is grave. I don't remember a time in a long life in politics, when there was so much widespread disenchantment, including the most privileged sections of our community in terms of their ability to be thinking about issues. My Lords, it's grave because out there extremism is real. Out there the memories of the 1930s should be dominant in our preoccupations. And we must not play into the hands of extremists. We have a huge responsibility at this juncture. But, my Lords, I also believe that what has been the failure has been the failure to put the issues that we talk about in terms of the possibility of another referendum in a wider political context. There's been a failure in real political debate and engaging the widest possible cross-section of the community. One issue in which I have always been concerned has, of course, been the issue of migration. What is disastrous is that in Britain it has become almost totally an issue of immigration. And immigration is just one consequence, or one part, of the much wider global issue of migration. Where in the whole debate about our relationship with Europe has there been a real concern about the part we should be playing in devising worldwide migration policies, without which we shall always be talking about sticking fingers in the dam or coping with a particular influx. My Lords, we haven't really debated in this context at all the relevance of it all to the world economy. Britain is a country utterly dependent upon the world economy. What are our policies towards the world economy? Ditto trading systems. My Lords, there's a great deal of preoccupation in Britain about social injustice, But it's not just a concern in Britain about social justice, poverty, the grotesque differentials in wealth within Britain. There are a lot of people in Britain who are deeply concerned about the global dimensions to all this. Where has that debate been? We are preoccupied sometimes almost neurotically about environmental issues, the latest, of course, being the very real issue of pollution and the damage it is doing in health terms to our children. Where has been the debate about that? My Lords, I believe that a referendum, further referendum, might be a fallback position. But I'm concerned that in a referendum we will be foregoing the chance for a real widespread public debate about how the European Union as an institution is relevant to the issues that confront us nationally and internationally in all these dimensions, and what our position should be in response to that. I believe that the best way of having that debate is in the context of a general election.
To focus my comments on three issues. First of all, the impact on the Yorkshire region of this agreement, the effect on local government, and some words about UK citizens living in the EU. Yorkshire has a population of over 5 million, and its businesses include a substantial manufacturing base, a fishing industry on the east coast, farming in North Yorkshire, a strong financial sector in Leeds, renowned universities with significant interests in EU-funded research projects, and a fine cultural sector. Each one of these anticipates a negative impact from Brexit with a deal, and for some, a disastrous impact with no deal. The West Yorkshire Combined Authority has reported on its concerns for the future replacement funding of the current €396 million supporting regional economic growth. And this fund has enabled the installation of a super-fast fibre broadband network across over 500 different postcode areas to boost business. That EU funding provides a very large resource that may no longer be available, and it will hit the prosperity of a region whose household income is already below the national average. For many members of this House, my lords, losing a few quid here and there won't make any difference. For people where I live, losing a few quid here and there makes a difference between existing and just surviving. Individual local authorities are also trying to mitigate the significant risks that leaving the EU will bring. Kirklees Council, on which I am a councillor, has evaluated those risks. Some of these are that the economic downturn will significantly affect business investment and survival, and hence business rates income to fund council services. The assessment is that house building will decline again, failing people who desperately need a home. Then there is the inability of employers in health and social care to fill vacancies and provide care because EU citizens, on which the care sector depends, are returning to their home countries. All these and more will result in even more pressure on council services that are already stretched to breaking point. In addition, there are two particular areas of concern. The first is for the waste disposal side of the council's statutory functions. Currently, waste can and is shipped to EU countries, for example, for the recycling of plastics. Waste approvals post-March 2019 will not be valid, and plastics and other waste materials will no longer be able to be sent to EU countries. There is a big question mark as to what happens to this waste material when government inaction means that our own plastic recycling sector may be unable to cope. And secondly, as this House is aware, there has been a rise in all forms of hate crime following the referendum in 2016. This has not abated. Community cohesion is, and will be, challenging for those of us who strive to see all people treated equally and with dignity. As the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has said, this is indeed a moral issue. Individual lives are being, and will be, profoundly affected by decisions we are making. Many members of your Lordship's House will have family members who have taken advantage of the freedom of movement to live and work in the EU. And I want to end with the reflections of young people from the UK who are part of the vibrant new classical music scene in Germany. This is what they say, and I quote, "I am living with immense uncertainty, not knowing how my circumstances are going to change. It is very stressful. Will I be able to continue working Europe-wide? Currently, I'm able to move freely and easily between different European countries for work. What will this mean for my colleagues working in the music field? Are we going to have to get a visa every time we have a concert in another European country? And finally, even though I and many hundreds of thousands of others have chosen to live in another EU country, we are still British citizens. We exercised our right to freely move, live, study and work in a new country. Brexit is putting our new lives in jeopardy. These young people and thousands of others are not outside Parliament shouting the odds, but their voices must be heard too. We are in danger as a country of only listening to the most outspoken, the most bellicose, the most threatening. Parliament has a duty also to hear and respond to the voices of those who have taken advantage of the freedoms the EU has enabled. The decision we are to make will profoundly affect individual lives, the future of our children and grandchildren. The greatness of our country lies in an outward-looking, cooperative pragmatism. We are in grave danger of creating a lesser country, one that is insular and introspective. I cannot and will not support that direction of travel. People in 2016 did not vote to harm their neighbours. They did not vote for a mean-minded country. People have a right to review the decision. Parliament must give them that opportunity in a people's vote.
Yeah. Very good.
My Lords, when last we attempted this debate, it seemed to me there was an elephant in the chamber. We had the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, but missing at the time was the white paper on immigration. I said then that to those sectors of the economy dependent for success on the movement of people and services across borders, this document was every bit as significant as the two on the order paper. I still believe that to be true, and so I make no apologies for focusing today on the ways in which this recently arrived white paper adds to our understanding of a future outside the EU. Now, like the political declaration, this white paper has its own elements, TBC, but it does at least provide some clarity of intention. It confirms, as anticipated, that the current dual entry system will be replaced with a single route for all countries. So far, so logical, except that this route will give access only to the skilled and the highly skilled, with no parallel flow of low and medium skilled workers coming, as now, from the EU. With virtual full employment in the UK, many business sectors rely on this supply chain, not least to fill vital but lower paid roles in health and social care. And we know from forecasts commissioned by this government that a further 725,000 medium and low-skilled roles open up every year, a figure roughly in line with the number of young people annually who turn 18. Is the intention for every one of these young people to occupy these low and medium-skilled roles? And if so, so much for the ambitions of the government's 2017 strategy to increase social mobility through education. To address this challenge in the short term, the paper proposes a transitional measure, a route that will see employers reliant on a rotating pool of low-paid workers on 12-month visas, workers with no right to settle and no job security. This will mean loss of know-how, discontinuity of service, constant recruitment and retraining, dips in standards, risks so clearly outlined by the noble lady Baroness Masham of Ilton earlier today. Some of these workers will be responsible for the most vulnerable in our society. They will be care workers, teaching assistants, and nurses. The paper also confirms the intention to measure a person's potential contribution by how much they earn, and I thank the noble lady Baroness Bonham Carter for giving airtime to my mantra on this. Once again, altogether now, salary levels are not a proxy for skills. We're promised a future in which only the brightest and the best are welcome, but in the sector I know best, culture and the creative industries, importing only established stars is not the way to ensure a thriving domestic sector. A vibrant sector depends on talent pipelines built by spotting and nurturing potential, by welcoming the entrepreneurs and the stars of the future, young people earning far less than £30,000. But by far the most dispiriting message in the paper can be found at paragraph 6.41, where the decision not to open a dedicated route for unskilled labour is described as, and I quote, consistent with the public's view that lower skilled migration labour may have depressed wages or stifled innovation in our economy. My Lords, this may or may not be the public's view, but the MAC's report repeatedly makes clear it is far from true. Paragraph 7, migrants have no or little impact on the overall employment and unemployment outcomes of the UK-born workforce. Paragraph 8, migration is not a major determinant of the wages of UK-born workers. Page 62, not only may migrants directly contribute to the levels of innovation, they may also enable UK workers to become more innovative by bringing with them complementary skills and ideas. It is deeply disturbing to see this important paper base its policies not on evidence but on perception. But perhaps it's not surprising, given the unswerving determination we've seen from the outset to end freedom of movement on the basis that it's the will of the people. My Lords, which people? The MAC itself notes that the UK may find itself ending free movement just as public concern falls about the migration flows that result from it. Monday's Ipsos Mori poll backs this up. Concerns about immigration are the lowest they have been for 16 years. And it's certainly not the will of the younger generation, for whom freedom of movement is a primary concern. Not in the sense the white paper refers to it, but in terms of the opportunities and rights that it brings in the areas of human and civil rights, cross-border families, travel, work, education and trade. The Ipsos Mori poll lists in order the issues of greatest public concern today, and after Brexit they are the NHS, poverty, crime, housing, the economy and education, and leaving the EU is not going to solve any of these. As the noble Lord Horan pointed out in December, the Brexit vote was a response to problems for which Brexit is not the solution. It will impact disproportionately on those areas that voted leave, and it ties up valuable government time that could be focused on these issues. I can't agree with those noble lords who see this as a reason just to get on with it. We may all be weary, but we have a responsibility to the next generation, whose voices and views are too often absent from this debate. It's their future we're debating, not ours. And I do understand concerns that failing to deliver on the 2016 vote might be seen to betray democracy, but the betrayal happened 3 years ago in a referendum based on corrupt practices and fantastical pledges made by people with no right to make them and no obligation to deliver. We're now in danger of committing a far greater betrayal, signing up to a deal everyone agrees will leave us worse off, or exiting without a deal in place. It's hard not to conclude that pushing the vote down the road alongside the visible ramping up of no-deal preparations is part of a strategy to ensure the deal passes in the other place. If the strategy fails, as it seems that it will, the ticking clock may leave us only two options. Apply to extend Article 50 so the public can choose between what's on offer and what we already enjoy, or revoke Article 50 and get on with addressing the issues of inequality, poverty, health and social care that are the everyday realities for communities up and down the country.
Yeah. My Lords, there are two harsh truths about this debate. Firstly, there is very little one can say about Brexit which has not been said before. Secondly, nothing any of us can say is likely to change the minds of people who think differently. I have not changed my mind since I last spoke in December, but I do have a new perspective after spending 2 weeks in continental Europe in the company of French and Germans. As I heard at first hand, the French and the Germans live in a deeply troubled country, politically and economically. The latest official figures, just came out last week, show sharp drops in industrial production in both countries. It is not surprising that they see Brexit as a hammer blow to their interests. What is more, deep down, each fears to be left alone with the other in a European Union without the United Kingdom. In our Brexit debates, we can be dangerously Anglo-centric, ignoring at our peril how things are seen from the other side of the Channel. For instance, by the end of the year, there will be a new president of the Council, a new president of a new Commission, a new president of the European Central Bank, and a newly elected European Parliament, where the so-called populists are expected to be heavily represented. We will be negotiating our future relationship with a whole new cast of characters. There will be risks and there will be opportunities. But as some of us British indulge in a shameful competition to come up with the most apocalyptic vision of Brexit, there are many on the other side of the Channel and of the Irish Sea who also have anxiety, and some of it in a worse degree. It may seem old-fashioned and ripe for satire, but what Britain could do right now with is a large dose of old wartime spirit. Keep calm and carry on. If the Prime Minister's deal is voted down, there is no cause for panic or hysteria. It is certainly no cause for parliamentarians to throw their hands in the air, deny their responsibility, and tell the public they got it wrong the first time and will they please try again. Brexit is not a game of pass the parcel, however difficult the decisions to be taken. As for no deal, a dishonest piece of this deceptive shorthand, if ever there was one, it is ludicrous to run screaming from the room at its very notion. What we should do instead is analysing the many different types of the so-called no deal, if push comes to shove, and we leave the EU without an agreement on March the 29th. Indeed, as Lord Lilly has pointed out, the WTO is a safe haven and not a hard option. And we will not be crashing out, but we will be possibly cashing in. I was horrified to read in a recent tweet by one of our members who claimed that Brexit would leave us worse off permanently. Permanently? Has anybody got any idea what permanently mean? Look at Galbraith, who is a well-known economist. He was saying the only function of economic forecast is to make astrology look reasonable. Any student of economics knows perfectly well that there are too many variables in human behavior to actually predict the future. I have already quoted one American president, I'm going to quote another one, President Franklin Roosevelt, who said, "The only thing we need to fear is fear itself." That is true today as it was then. It is about time that we, the United Kingdom, set an example to the nation and throw off the negative, the defeatist, the abusive attitudes, which I do object when other people call us little-minded and narrow-minded. We are allowed to have our own opinion, and this is the whole thing about this debate, is that everybody should have their own opinion, and we should be courteous to each other. And the point is, Brexit was never going to be easy. I mean, people who voted to get out knew that it was never going to be easy after 60 years of membership. How could it be easy? But we know that people and business is going to adapt the same way as when we became a member of the European Union, we also had to adapt. And I believe that this country can do it. And I'm sorry to say, but I would like it to be more positive and to stop the negativeness that goes on all the time. I find it very depressing.
My Lords, present circumstances present a major challenge to Parliament. A month down the line, we've had a government determined for delay, taking up 1 month of the 4 left up to March 29 to do what? Start again now. Resolute for repetition. No deal is better than a bad deal. As if the repetition proves the assertion. And when the crunch comes about no deal, obvious incompetence in the choice of a company like Seaborne Freight. The public outside Parliament must be deeply concerned as to what on earth is going on. The world outside is, as I glean from my frequent travelling, shocked that this country could find itself in this state of affairs. This challenge now has to be met by Parliament. Nicky Morgan, ex-cabinet minister, said at the beginning of the week, Parliament has been denied a say on the way forward for too long. It is time for it to assert itself. The Commons have done. The Finance Bill amendment requiring a no deal scenario to be brought back for decision by Parliament, and yesterday, if the vote is lost by the government next Tuesday, they have to come back with a next steps programme within 3 days. That's action. And it bespeaks a desire by Parliament to become the deciding voice, not acting as a government, but acting as the representative spokespeople of the electorate who brought us here in the Commons and here by appointment. I think process in Parliament for the next few months is vital. We have to show the country can competently progress this matter. There are specialist committees of both houses. We have no break coming up except for a weekend. It transpires after yesterday. And we have just short of 4 months in which to use our committees, along with those in the Commons, and to have debates in the Chamber, in both houses, designed to inform the world outside and ourselves about what we are about, with much more competence and detail than broad debates permit. Some suggestions about what to discuss. The first is the consequences of no deal. Not from cloistered economists or national institutions, but from the people involved. The Most Reverend Primate yesterday has spoken to experts in Kent, has used past actual experience as evidence as to what might happen in the future to show the problems there of no deal will be a really material risk to the benefits of Kent and the country. That's a topic we should be on top of, and the country should understand. Next, trading with the WTO regime. I tell the House last time that I've been involved in trade negotiations between countries not with the WTO. Can I remind the House the Doha round to create the WTO after GATT stopped after 6 failed years in the early 2000s because nobody could agree on how to shape it for the future. What were the logjams? The European Union and the United States refusing to change their systems of agricultural subsidies. And we talk about going in on WTO terms as if you sign a document, press a button, and everything starts normally. Every country in the WTO has its own interests to serve. And if there's a dispute, it's supposed to go to a judicial panel of judges for resolution. But at the moment, there isn't one that's functioning. Why not? Because the United States refused to support appointments that are necessary to the judicial panel. So we'll be joining a WTO with no internal system working to resolve problems. This morning, Greg Clark, the Minister for Business, states that business, commerce, industry in this country regard WTO as a dire prospect based on rudimentary systems that don't reflect modern commerce and trade. The government's minister quoting that today. Are we ready for this? Are we educated enough ourselves to the people outside with whom we're going to negotiate think we're serious? Finally, an extension, if necessary, of Article 50, which can surely be obtained if the objective is to allow Parliament more time to make a more considered decision and, if necessary, to put forward a new proposal. What does all this mean? It means that Parliament is now required to provide leadership, to inform the public, impress the world outside that we know what we're about, and achieve an exit from Europe in whichever way we do that is reasoned, transitional, and balanced, and in accord with our traditions of being a serious, trading nation fit to do trade with once we're out of Europe?
My Lords, it's been my view, repeated perhaps too often in speech after speech in this House, that once the government declared it would not stay in the customs union and the single market, we were heading for no deal. Whatever ingenious schemes might be developed by top Department for Brexit civil servants, the Irish border question would remain insoluble, and still is. The May deal is probably as near as any scheme can get to a solution, but still doesn't solve the problem in practice, and it seems certain to be defeated. Also, the Commissioner writes that no further negotiations can now solve it. There's no time. The Article 50 timetable can be extended, but not for further negotiations. Labour, please note. In fact, probably the best and most certain way to avoid the disaster of a no-deal Brexit, and indeed to obtain an extension of Article 50, is a new people's vote. That no-deal Brexit would be disaster could not have been more clearly demonstrated than by the speeches of Lord Hayne and Lord Kerr yesterday, and many others, including Lord Brennan, today. But a people's vote, I'm told, at the moment doesn't command a majority in the Commons. Why? It's said to be undemocratic because it would overturn the 2016 vote. Really? When did it become anti-democratic to reverse a vote if circumstances change? One of the few sensible things David Davis has said in recent times is that to deny a change of opinion is to deny democracy. Only dictatorships don't allow people to change their minds. And where is the evidence that 52% of the voters did not care if Brexit meant the devastation of integrated supply chains and its consequent devastating impact on jobs in manufacturing in Britain? A very large eve of poll service in 2016, I believe the only poll of what the reasons were why people voted, found that almost all leavers believed Brexit would have no downside, but would promise a future in the sunny uplands. It's said that a new vote would be decisive, as if we're not a divided nation now. That it might lead to violence. Since when has the threat of violence become a reason for abandoning policy? Are hooligans like those outside Parliament a few days ago to dictate what we may vote for?
Correct.
That really would be the end of democracy. My Lords, what I really cannot understand is why so many Conservatives no longer seem to care about our standing and influence in the world. Many people abroad long admired our record for political stability and common sense and skilled diplomacy. Now that reputation is lost, we are regarded with a mixture of astonishment and pity. The world today faces grave dangers to democracy. An aggressive Russia, a nationalist, more isolationist United States poised to abandon its leadership of democracy in the world, China, an increasingly powerful world force, rising populism and nationalism in Europe encouraged by Brexit. And at a time when Europe's influence as a centre of democracy and stability has never been more important, Britain, which could play a vital role, is about to weaken Europe's and destroy its own influence. Nor do I understand Labour's leaders who claim they will listen to their membership, but yet refuse the overwhelming view of Labour members and Labour voters who support a people's vote and indeed remain. If Labour supported a new vote, we would get one. My Lords, perhaps I'm an incurable optimist, but I believe Parliament and the Labour Party will in the end come round to accepting that since MPs can't agree, there must be a new people's vote. And as opinion polls now indicate, the disaster of Brexit can be avoided. My Lords, I would end by reference to the speech made by my old friend and colleague, Lord Rogers. He and I became friends when we were students at Oxford together. We became members of Parliament within a few weeks of each other. I'm the older. I'm much older than he is by at least 10 days. We were also, I think, we are also, I think, the only surviving members in Parliament of the glorious 69 Labour MPs who voted against a three-line whip in 1972 and secured our entry into Europe. I myself fought a by-election on the issue and won it on the basis of saying country first, constituency second and party third. Now, is it really too much to hope that Conservatives, most of whom certainly Conservative members of Parliament and indeed members of this place, is it too much to hope that these Conservatives will, on this occasion, when it comes to a crunch, put the interest of the nations first and not the interest of the party?
Yeah.
Very good. My Lords, in this high-calibre and important debate, I've heard most of the speeches and listened with great care and interest. I did miss a very few speeches, but so far I have heard little on the views, needs and hopes of business, though indeed there has been more today. With respect, without business and trade, we have nothing. They provide employment, taxes, national insurance, and by extension health, social security, education, defence, and really pretty well everything. Business is critical, and I say this on a day when Prime Minister Abe arrives in London. I remember vividly how, when I was Lord Mayor in 2016, shortly after the referendum, I was visited in the Mansion House by the then Japanese ambassador. This representative of a friendly country, a large and welcome investor in this country, a good employer and provider of, I think at that time, over 120,000 valuable jobs. He was stunned at the outcome. Much of the investment assumed easy access to the EU. My Lords, I am sure all agree that business, and not least the views of our international investors and partners, are tremendously important. So I want to broaden the lens to try to capture a view from a business I know well, maritime. Many noble lords, including our Lord Convener Lord Hope, have noted the unhappy predicament we find ourselves in. In a debate of the highest standard such as this, with views very well articulated, we can confound ourselves with all the considerations. I want to try to inject a positive and more optimistic note. Here I declare my interest as recorded on the register as Chairman of Maritime London and as a council member and former chairman of Maritime UK, which works with the government to promote the sector nationally and internationally. Maritime is one of the UK's biggest industries. The latest data commissioned by Maritime UK from the leading economic consultancy CEBR at the end of 2017 estimated that the sector directly supported just over £40 billion in business turnover, 14.5 billion in GVA, and nearly 186,000 employees in 2015. The substantial direct economic contribution of the maritime sector exceeds that of other comparable industries, such as aerospace, by some margin. Average productivity in the maritime sector exceeds the national average, and this is true also of each subsector of the industry. This is an important and efficient sector, but it is more than those figures and statistics. We are an island nation, and we must always remember that 95% of our exports and imports are affected by sea. Our highly efficient ports are at the centre of this, investing over £600 million of their own funds annually to maintain and enhance their efficient and rapid service. And they are looking to increase this if
they get certainty in the business outlook. My Lord, for the first time in decades, the importance of this nation remaining a great trading nation comes to the fore, and the maritime industries are the enabler and the facilitator. The British government has estimated that by 2030, the blue or ocean economy, that's the wider maritime industries, aquaculture, undersea mapping, subsea mining, and so on, will exceed $3 trillion a year. This is a time of great opportunity for the UK. We are fortunate that the UK remains perhaps the world's leading maritime centre, blessed with a close cooperation with government. However, we are under intense pressure from competitor maritime centres around the world, the Far East, Scandinavia and the Gulf, to name a few. My Lords, as we leave, the maritime sector is key to positioning the UK as an outward-looking and global trading nation. There is a great potential for potential growth in the industry and to play a major part in growing our nation's exports, in driving innovation and, importantly, in bringing growth and opportunity to our disadvantaged coastal areas. That is why this sector also cannot support a hard Brexit. We have had far too much uncertainty for the last 3 years. It has already been said repeatedly in the House that a hard Brexit where Britain crashes out surely is not the way the United Kingdom, a world leader in many things, not least the rules-based international order, should conduct itself. This isn't theoretical gameplay. Let's be clear, the EU will remain our most important market. Surely this isn't the way to build a solid future relationship with our neighbours. For these reasons, and accepting that this is not a perfect deal, the maritime sector supports the proposed agreement. In this, we share the views of the vast majority of business organisations. Now, we are in rapidly moving times. The days ahead will throw up many developments, I'm quite sure. We're hearing a goodly number of calls in the debate for a people's vote. As a Remainer myself, I see attraction in this. But there is a significant risk that a vote to remain would be a gift to populists and populism. So, therefore, any move in that direction has to be very, very clear how that's going to be sold to the very large number of people who voted to go and for whom it was a protest vote, remembering that many of us in the chamber today are really in that southeast bubble. So, in the absence of some very, very great confidence that we can sell that to everybody and get acceptance, we should work to get this deal across the line so that we can concentrate on future relations and give ourselves 2 years to prepare, to gear, to meet up the great opportunities that we must now grasp. This is a time for cool heads. We need to work on the next stage and to use the time to gear up, to refine our strategies, to enhance our export promotion organisations, to identify how to ensure Britain is still a still greater place to do business, to seize the opportunities. In such case, we should agree the withdrawal agreement and accelerate work in realising this potential. There is no time to waste.
My Lords, it is a pleasure to follow the noble Lord, Lord Mount Evans, and to hear his views on the maritime industry, of which he is, of course, a great expert. But I shall not be following him down that particular path. As the 76th speaker in this debate, I fear it will be impossible to avoid some repetition, and I can only hope that my homework will not be downgraded too severely because of it, my Lords. The trouble with the withdrawal agreement is that neither the leavers nor the remainders like it. And if the Prime Minister could get some meaningful concession on the backstop, it is very unlikely that it would be enough to get it over the line. But on the positive side, it is encouraging to hear that she has firmly stated her opposition to the idea of a second referendum, and she has also ruled out cancelling or postponing Article 50. We live in a very fast-moving political landscape, my Lords, and this, of course, could change. But whatever happens in the weeks to follow, I fervently hope that we will not go down the route of a second referendum, which would be incredibly divisive for the country, as my noble friend Lord Strathclyde said so persuasively in his speech earlier today. And, of course, just think what a Pandora's box it would open for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, my lords. Encouragingly, there has been a gearing up of planning for a clean Brexit on March the 28th. Not a cliff-edge Brexit or a crashing-out Brexit, as it is so often referred to, but a clean Brexit, my lords. Contingency planning and some bilateral agreements are being put in place to clarify the position on air travel, commercial lorries, expatriates, and although very late in the day, this is all good news. And, my lords, as was mentioned in a speech yesterday by a noble lord, during an interview on Radio 4 yesterday, the president and chairman of the ports of Calais and Boulogne was at pains to explain that comprehensive plans have already been put in place to ensure that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, there would be no delays in commercial traffic passing through these ports. And as it seems inconceivable that we should sabotage our exports by placing cumbersome checks on our side of the channel, he was at a loss to see what the fuss was all about. If noble lords were unable to hear that, I recommend it as required listening. I agree with all noble lords who advocate having a free trade agreement with the EU immediately post 29th of March, and then, after an agreed period, moving on to the WTO terms. Many respected businessmen also believe this, and my noble friend Lord Mancroft, who sadly is not in his place, did mention them by name. But I don't think he also mentioned the past governor of the Bank of England, the noble Lord King of Lothbury. But I believe this to be the right course for another reason, and one which happily is now receiving more attention and which other noble lords have referred to, and that is the concern I have for our armed forces and intelligence services if we sign up to this agreement. The former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, and the Falklands hero Major General Julian Thompson, along with other former senior military and security figures, have warned that the government has embedded the UK in EU defence and security structures without seeking proper parliamentary oversight or approval, and they argue, convincingly in my view, that this constitutes a threat to national security, putting our UK forces and the intelligence and security interests under the emerging superstructure of EU policy. In a strongly worded letter to all MPs dated the 7th of December, they said the following: "The first duty of the state, above trade, is the security of its citizens, and the withdrawal agreement abrogates this fundamental contract and will place control of aspects of our national security in foreign hands. Vote against this bad agreement." And in a further statement, they go on to say that the flexible partnership was not on offer, only subordination to the inflexible pooled law of the EU. And the defence documents show that if the UK participates in EU defence, it accepts third country status, third country associated status. And according to some reports I have read, our own officials have apparently been heard acknowledging in private that the government had known that these strict EU participation criteria would apply when they agreed to authorise joining the defence military frameworks between November 2016 and June 2017. Understanding this, my honourable friend Sam Guimard, MP, resigned as a minister, and as noble lords will remember, I think he was the 7th minister in the government to resign, calling the plan naive, not in the British national interest, and that voting for it would set ourselves up for failure by surrendering our voice, our vote, and our veto. I believe he was also prompted by the EU determining that we should have no further involvement with the Galileo satellite project, despite having one or possibly two tracking and support stations on UK overseas territories. I'm getting close to my 6 minutes, my lords, so I shall be selective here. In conclusion, my Lords, I'd like to thank and congratulate Mr. Nicholas Shrimpton for proposing we add another acronym to our lexicon. Mandate, my Lords. In a letter published in last week's Sunday Telegraph, he says, we need the acronym mandate, managed and no deal and timely exit. The government certainly has a mandate for it. The referendum, the repeal of the European Communities Act 1972, and the invoking of Article 50, all with substantial majorities. The Prime Minister has usefully established that the least bad deal, what the least bad deal would be, it is not good enough. Let us get on with mandate. I couldn't have put it better myself, my Lord.
My Lords, there have been many failures of leadership in the political process of deciding on what terms and how to leave the EU. By far the greatest has been the lack of any serious attempt at reconciliation by the government of those in favour of leaving and those in favour of remaining. How many times have we heard the mantra, the people have spoken? Yes, they have, but just over half spoke in one way and just under a half spoke in another. In those circumstances, surely it was incumbent on the government to act to try to bring a divided country closer together. Surely it would have been right to spend some time listening to Remainers as well as Leavers and to try to shape a Brexit structure which took into account their views too. Instead, the Prime Minister rushed into invoking Article 50 and drew red lines, having done little or nothing to promote a consensus. The views of those in her own party wanting a hard Brexit were allowed to prevail. The Prime Minister's attempt to reach out to the electorate to persuade them of the merits of the deal that we are once again debating were a consequence of desperately trying to conjure up pressure on MPs from their constituents. They were not part of a well-thought-out approach to create a more informed debate which should have taken place over the last 2 years. We are told that the response of many people was get on with it, we're fed up with Brexit, so we support your deal which will bring it to an end. But is the government telling them the truth? This is not the end, it is only the beginning. There are months, even years ahead before the transition period is concluded, which will be marked by yet more bitter argument and infighting. The people were told lies when it was claimed that leaving the EU would be easy. We now need honesty in how much more negotiation will be needed, even if Mrs May gets her withdrawal deal. The choice the government is asking Parliament to make between the withdrawal agreement and no deal is dishonest too. I know there are some people in this House and in another place who I will call the Brexit militant tendency who want to crash out. However, the prospect for most of us is too awful to contemplate, not just because of the economic damage it will do, as the Treasury, the Governor of the Bank of England and the business community have made clear, but also because of the threats to our security with respect to terrorism and serious cross-border crime, the huge damage it will do to our world-leading university sector, the chaos at our borders, and too many other dire consequences to list in the time available. So we should not be browbeaten to support the government's withdrawal deal for fear that no deal might happen. Assuming the Prime Minister's deal is rejected, as seems likely, I hope that MPs will consider no deal as a matter of urgency, reject it, and end any further wasteful and needless expenditure squandered on planning for it. The many reasons for rejecting the government's withdrawal deal have been set out by other speakers, and I'm not going to repeat them. But two issues are just worth re-emphasising. First, it does not allow us to take back control. It actually means losing control. And second, the political declaration lacks a clear sense of direction about the government's end goals. It is well-meaning, but essentially a list of platitudes. I'm not a fan of plebiscites, but I now accept that if Parliament cannot agree on a way through the current deadlock, it would be right to return to the electorate. I do not accept the argument that it would be undemocratic. By the time of another vote, it would be 3 years since the last one. In those 3 years, we have learnt a great deal that most people did not know before about the many problems posed by leaving the European Union. So many different aspects of the nation's economic, social and political life after over 40 years of membership would unravel. In the light of this, and no parliamentary consensus, why is it undemocratic to give people the chance to change their view, or for that matter, to confirm their view? I want to end with young people. I've raised their position once before when debating Europe in the House, and I do so again. The evidence of the pressures they are under is clear. The first generation to be worse off than their parents at a similar age, faced with housing costs they cannot meet, often in insecure jobs, with incomes that are too low for them to save, and with debts to repay, huge debts to repay if they are graduates. Why on earth would we knowingly choose to jeopardise their future further? It is they who will bear the brunt of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's depressing economic scenario. They have their lives ahead of them and will be more deeply affected by what might happen than most of us. By June next year, there will be 3 cohorts of young people who were not old enough to vote in the 2016 referendum. A people's vote would allow them to do so. My Lords, many young people are idealistic about being part of a wider international community in Europe and beyond. They seek to find common ground on issues that concern them, from climate change to the fight against poverty. They dislike narrow nationalism. This is why well over 80% of them want to remain in the European Union. We should let them have their say. Finally, I want to ask the Minister, when he replies, to tell the House what the government plans to do if, as is expected, it loses the vote on Tuesday. The Prime Minister's humiliating decision to pull the vote on December the 11th wasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks, my Lords. So I believe it is the Minister's duty, when he sums up, to indicate what options the government is considering for the three-day window it will now have. If he merely repeats that we will leave on March the 29th without a deal, which is what has been said in this House so many times before, this will be wholly irresponsible and deeply shocking.
Yeah.
My Lords, I beg to move that this debate be now adjourned until Monday, 14th January.
The question is that this debate be now again adjourned until Monday, the 14th of January. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.